this webinar series. My name is Jillian Davies, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. The general format of the webinar will be a 40 to 45-minute presentation by our speaker, followed by approximately 15 minutes of questions from the participants. Also, we will announce the next webinar at the end of this session, and generally we're following a monthly schedule. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping announcements. Just to familiarize you with the GoToMeeting screens, there's an attendee control panel where you can control the audio for the webinar. You can use audio through your computer or telephone and can consult the directions in the audio pane on how to do that. At any time during the presentation, you can type questions that you want to ask the speaker, and you use the questions pane to do that. As the moderator during the Q&A time, I'll read the questions to the presenter so that everyone can hear the questions clearly. I want to note that all attendee phone lines are on mute to cut out background noises and distractions. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording following the webinar. We also ask that you take a moment to complete the evaluation survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar. This will help us plan for future events. If you'd like a copy of today's slides, please find a PDF copy in the handout section of the control pane. And if you're really tech savvy and you want to tweet about today's webinar, please use hashtag SWSwebinar. So I'd like to test the questions pane and at the same time get a little demographic info by having everyone type the state or country you're participating from and how many people are viewing the webinar with you. So I see Virginia, Florida, Columbia, Missouri, Louisiana, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Maryland, Kansas, Washington, Florida, Pennsylvania, Kentucky. Great. Thanks very much. With the logistics out of the way, let's get started with our webinar. It's my pleasure to welcome today's presenter, Lisa Fernandez. Lisa oversees Operations and Communications Strategy at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. In particular, she manages outreach concerning the YPCCC's signature research project, the Climate Change in the American Mind biannual survey, measuring American public opinion on global warming. She leads project management in YPCCC's international networking efforts, building a global network of climate communication scholars and practitioners. Previously, she worked in urban environmental conservation and sustainable development in the U.S. and Latin America. She has served as a consultant to the United Nations Development Program, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the World Bank. She was a fellow at the World Wildlife Fund USA and a city planner implementing solid waste prevention policy for the city of New York. She serves on the boards of the East Coast Greenway Alliance and the Farmington Canal Rail to Trail Association. She was a 10-year political appointee on the Connecticut Greenways Council as well. Lisa holds an MBA and MEM from Yale and a BA from Princeton.
Great. Thank you so much, Jillian. Let me see if this works. Okay. All right. I'm trying to move forward, and it's not working. Let me see. Oh, there we go. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure and truly an honor to be speaking with a society of scientists. We do a lot of work trying to evaluate what the American public thinks about climate science and their opinions and beliefs and attitudes about scientists. So it's great to actually speak with a group that are themselves experts in that, because you are those very scientists that we're trying to get a sense of what Americans really think about. So without further ado, I just want to, let's see if I can move on to even the next slide. New. I don't know, Allison, if you're there, maybe I can just say next slide because I'm not, there we go. Okay, and you can even move on to the next one. I just want to give a tiny little overview of what our mission is. We've been around for about 9 years now, and we started out as a very tiny research program, just myself and the director, Anthony Leiserowitz, who is a social scientist who did some early work in the geography of climate change and has really kind of been a founder of this whole field. So we largely conduct research. We're now a team of about 6 or 7 staff and faculty and students working together to execute on these surveys and field them twice a year. So we're really interested and have been for almost a decade now, really interested in public attitudes on climate, also level of climate knowledge, what people perceive as the risks associated with global warming, how they make decisions about what to do about it, and how they act in that domain. And then we don't just want those survey results to sit on a shelf. We really want them to be implemented by professional communicators, including yourselves. And that means taking those findings and tweaking, looking at what they might imply for how best to frame messages for different types of audiences. And we'll get more into that in a little bit. And then, of course, we're not just trying to, be analysts of what Americans think, feel, and do about climate, or testing messages. We also, which are both kind of coaching the voices, we also want to be the voice. And just in the past few years, we've become more of a voice ourselves. We actually produce a daily 90-second radio show that talks about different solutions to climate change, interviews people and organizations that are involved in tackling the issue from many different perspectives, and is meant to provide a sense of hope that there are solutions, that things are happening, and progress is being made in terms of mitigating and adapting to climate. If you can just move on to the next slide. Just briefly wanted to give a shout out to those who have supported us over the years. We have many foundations and government entities, NSF and NOAA, have been instrumental in funding some of our more cutting edge research, and we have many supporters in the foundation world as well, and I just want to make sure that they're thanked. And one that is actually not up here yet and is new this year, which we're very excited about, is the MacArthur Foundation. I'm sorry, so this slide is already out of date. If you could move on to the next slide. So I'm going to give you, the first thing I'm going to go through is just a little overview of what is the current state of public opinion on climate change. Next slide, please. But starting out by introducing this concept of messages and the simplicity of messages. So I propose couching our findings around the simplest bits of information that need to be conveyed about global warming, and really we've distilled that down to, if you can just move on to the next slide, 5 messages in just 10 words. The simple messages can really change belief that can lead to action. It's important to find specific messages to put your trusted voices behind and then convey those as often as possible. So simple messages by trusted messengers. Much of our surveys, many of the results of our surveys show that scientists are among the most trusted messengers in American society. Now you may feel like as a scientist yourself that you're getting picked on a lot because there is kind of a fundamentalist strain in American society, but if you compare scientists to other types of individuals that people may or may not trust, scientists always come out at the top of that list in terms of the amount of trust that people put in you. Also, and as scientists, I'm sure that you're with me on this one, pick messages that are evidence-based. The right messages have been shown to change belief and get people closer to action, and we'll get more into the details on that. So the big 5 messages are: it's real, it's human caused, yes, it's bad, it's harmful. I'm talking obviously about climate change. Scientists agree on this issue, and there's hope. Next slide. So I really don't need to belabor the point here. I'm sure that everybody in this audience understands that the Earth's average surface temperature has risen about 1.5 degrees of Fahrenheit over the last century or so. And you can see from this graph that the rate of warming over the last 50 years was double that for the period as a whole that's shown here. And anyway, so the red bars indicate temperatures above, and blue bars indicate temperatures below the average temperature for the last century. And this is a slide from NOAA. Next slide, please. So first message, it's us. So yes, climate change is human-caused. Transportation accounts for more than 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions and has been the fastest growing source in recent years. Next slide. Third message out of 5, it's harmful. With Tropical Storm Sandy in October 2012, we saw the kind of impact that global warming can have. This is a slide, I believe, from the New Jersey shore. So what started happening then, what we noticed in our research and our surveys, was that a mental model of how global warming works began to cohere among the public, at least in the Northeast where Sandy happened. This was the first time that people really, especially the media, really started to feel free to do what we call, attribution. They were attributing the extreme weather event that Sandy represented to climate change, and people were explicit about that and fairly accepting of that. That has been something that has been contested for many years and still is contested, but we'll go over later some of the analogies and how empowered you should feel to attribute weather. And for example, I'm sure that a lot of you deal with flooding issues, coastal flooding, how you should feel empowered to feel free to attribute that to climate change in general. So, so what's the mental model that began to cohere? So just speaking very simplistically, burning fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide, it goes to the atmosphere, it acts like a blanket trapping heat. Much of the heat energy goes into ocean water. Increased temperatures cause increased evaporation, and increased evaporation also means more moisture is in the atmosphere because more water is available then for big rain and snow events. So burning fossil fuels is leading to increases in the likelihood of extreme weather. Next slide. To extend the theme on the negative impacts, this slide shows how much warmer New Hampshire is getting. I'm from New Hampshire originally, and we've always prided ourselves about being part of upper or northern New England, not like those lower New Englanders that live in Connecticut, like where I live now. But guess what? We're there already in terms of temperatures, and we're seeing how maple syrup producers are struggling, and the increase in insect vectors moving north as the Earth temperature warms. Okay, go ahead to the next slide, please. The fourth message, scientists agree. This is the simplest kind of visualization possible. A pie chart showing that 97% of climate scientists have concluded that human-caused global warming is happening. We'll talk more about these nice, simple visuals and how important they are to conveying facts when people don't even understand the most basic facts, which is very often about climate change because it's a complicated topic. Next slide, please. So the last of the 5 messages, there's hope. Yes, plenty of it, and more every day, as I'm sure you're aware. You know, we have the Paris Accord now. There's been a worldwide kind of warm, fuzzy feeling where 195 nations got together and agreed about climate change. I mean, the fact that 195 nations could come together and agree about anything is astounding. That they could agree to do something about climate change is even more incredible. But just in terms of sort of on-the-ground examples, this is just one, obviously, wind technology, but there's lots and lots of clean energy technology to be deployed and increasingly being deployed and successfully. Profit-making for the entrepreneurs who are making it happen, and obviously helping to reduce carbon emissions in particular markets and locales. So, and that's in addition, of course, to increasing efficiency and improving conservation. Next slide, please. I'd like to go a little bit deeper into the results of our work. So this is really the part of the presentation that's specifically on the results of our twice-yearly surveys that we conduct in the spring and the fall. This is our signature research, Climate Change in the American Mind. So again, I'm going to organize these findings according to those 5 messages that I just presented. So next slide, please. So here we go. The first message is climate change real? We always ask this from the very beginning, from the very first survey that we conducted in 2008. We ask the question in the same way so that we have really, really good trend data of how Americans' opinion changes over time and how their answer changes over time. So this question is, do you think global warming is happening? So what we find is that in the last couple of years, almost 3 years now, it's basically hovered at around 2 out of 3 Americans think that global warming is happening. Can you move on to the next slide? So is it human caused? That's more complicated. And that question is, assuming global warming is happening, do you think it is caused by humans or by mostly caused by humans or mostly caused by natural changes in the environment? So what we find here is that just for the past few years, it's hovered around 1 out of 2 Americans thinks that it's largely attributable to human activities. And you can see that way back when we first conducted this survey, there was a larger proportion who agreed with that statement that it's caused mostly by human activities, and it's since gone down and stayed a little bit lower than it was initially. Next slide, please. Okay, so this again, this is the third of those messages. Is it bad? What we find is that over half of Americans are worried about global warming, but few are very worried, right? So we only have about 12% of respondents saying that they're very, very worried. But we get up to about half of Americans who are worried if you include those who are somewhat worried. Next slide, please. So here we revisit the pie chart. What we see here is that there's a big discrepancy between the scientific understanding of the reality of global warming and its anthropogenic nature and the American public, right? So there's obviously a huge gap here. 97% of climate scientists say that climate change is happening in human-caused, but only 41% of the American public thinks climate change is happening in human-caused. Next slide, please. So another way to look at this is that really only 1 out of 10 Americans understand that more than 90% of climate scientists say that climate change is human-caused and that it's happening. That's a very small number of people given essentially the consensus on this topic in the scientific community. And that's actually huge, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But moving on to the last message. Next slide, please. There's hope. So this one always depresses me to present this slide because it shows that actually Americans are not very optimistic that we will make a huge difference and be able to truly tackle global warming in the way we have to. So you see that almost 50%, 46% in our latest survey. And by the way, I should mention that we do have results now from our fall survey last year, but there were some little tweaks we were doing to the numbers, so I wasn't comfortable putting my slides together and updating my slides. So this information is now about 8 months old. So you see that half of Americans say that, yeah, we could do something about it, but it's really not clear that we'll do what we need to. And really, only the smallest percentage, 6% of Americans, say that we can reduce global warming and we will do so successfully. So that's pretty depressing. People are in general not very hopeful that we are going to be able to tackle it. Now, I know I already mentioned the Paris Accord from the latest Conference of the Parties, obviously in Paris in December. And I'm not sure, I'm actually quite curious how these numbers have changed since then. We asked some specific questions about how Americans felt about the importance of making an international agreement, and the results were fairly positive on that, but they're not included here. Okay, now I'd like to turn to how we've downscaled these results. If you could just move on to the next slide, please, Allie. So, just in the past couple of years, we've done something that we consider extremely exciting with our data. Now, keep in mind that these have been nationally representative surveys with a very reasonable margin of error. And this is a panel of over 1,000 people. It's incredible to think, but if you understand statistics, you know that that does make a representative sample of the nation. But we've always been very interested in all these new big data sources really have upped the ante on modeling for downscaling these results. So we were able to apply some models that were first developed in the field of political science. So what we did is and this is just the front cover of the paper that we put together last year in Nature Climate Change, in which we released a statistical model that downscales our national survey results and estimates key indicators of public climate change understanding and policy support at the state level, at the level of congressional districts, at the level of each of the more than 3,000 counties in our country, and at the level of individual cities. So in addition to this paper, of course, which is largely for the academic and scholarly community that's interested in big data and using big data for modeling, we also went live with an interactive website where you can look at public opinion about climate change at any of those scales, state, congressional district, county. And the website is, I don't know if you want to write this down if anybody's particularly interested, environment.yale.edu/POE/V2014. The 2014 refers to the fact that the data that we used to develop that model is from 2014. Actually, very, very soon, we will be updating that with 2015 data to make it more current. So I hope that you can connect the dots here and see that this breakthrough is incredibly valuable, providing insights about public opinion and policy to decision makers and advocates and communicators, basically at all levels of society. So if you're like a local environmental group, in Kansas somewhere, you can figure out what folks think about climate change in your county based on this modeling project. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to present some examples of its power. So here's just one where it shows the estimated percentage of adults who think global warming is happening in 2014, and for the United States overall, 63%. In California, so then you can look at how states compare to that national average, and there's a color bar on the right that helps you key in very efficiently to that. And what we see is that California, for example, is at 70% believing that global warming is happening. And that's important, obviously, for politicians, for any elected official, or again, for anybody communicating about this topic in more of a local area, which is pretty much always the case. Move on to the next slide, please. So keep in mind, California is at 70%, but here we see, West Virginia is only at 54% of believing that climate change is happening. And, obviously we don't just have to speculate as to why. We know that West Virginia is a huge coal state with a huge amount of investment in the labor force, in the culture, in coal, and climate change and tackling climate change and solutions to it are generally threatening to that particular industry. Moving on to the next slide. So here, this is just an example from my own congressional district, number 3 in Connecticut. It's just a great example of how we can use this information locally. So there's reasonable level of support right here in my hometown, in the environs here in this congressional district. This is Rosa DeLauro's district. She's a really famous representative down in DC who's been a huge advocate for taking action on climate change. So we see that there's really good support for requiring utilities to produce 20% of electricity from renewable sources. Moving on to the next slide. Is it humans? And you can see here in this color bar chart how the U.S. breaks out. And we have a little bit of what is, the coastal phenomenon, where we have the populations on both coasts being kind of a more liberal demographic, having a much higher belief in the level of human causation. Now, it's not necessarily that being liberal means you're going to believe that it's human caused, but you'll see later when I go through our different audience segments that is kind of a tendency and an association. But again, you're looking there at the level of every county in our country, and you can see, what the percentage is in that particular county that believes that it's human, that it's anthropogenic. Moving on to the next slide. Here we go. Here's the message about scientific agreement. And you can see that it's largely blue, which means less than, as the bluer it gets, the lower proportion of the population understands that most scientists think global warming is happening, and you see some outliers. And here's what's interesting. Look at Texas. Texas overall is blue, different shades of blue, but there's one county there, Travis County, Texas, that has a majority, just barely, of the population that thinks that most scientists think global warming is happening. Well, what's happening in Travis County, Texas, that is kind of an exception to the skepticism about that in Texas? So moving on to the next slide. We see that, and I'll be curious to hear from people in the audience who may be from Texas who will probably have more granular knowledge about this. But you can see it's a university town. It's where the University of Texas at Austin is located. Probably, I'm speculating now, but more liberal community, also very highly educated. So we can learn things from this downscaling project that would be very hard to grasp if we didn't have this modeling exercise under our belt, showing us this local level data, which is just fantastic. So just to, can you just go back one slide? I want to go into a little more detail just on this one, where you're looking at the county level there, and talk a little bit more about the scientific agreement and the lack of understanding on the part of most Americans that there is a consensus about climate change being real and being anthropogenic. There's major consequences to this, because people who understand that there is agreement, scientific agreement, are more likely to believe that it's happening and that it's human caused and that it's harmful. If your perception is that there's a lot of disagreement among experts and you're not an expert, you're much less likely to focus on the topic if you feel like it's not resolved. There's no conclusions about it, and you're much less likely to be convinced yourself. So, there's a lot of reasons for this. One of them is that often scientists don't communicate that well with the public. They communicate very well with each other. But it's not something that they're trained to do, that they're rewarded for in the course of their careers often. There's also, as we are all aware, a well-organized disinformation campaign, actually, explicitly modeled on the very successful campaign in the tobacco industry of a few decades ago, where they convinced people for many, many years, and officials as well, and decision makers, that smoking was actually healthy. Now, what we've been able to show with some of our messaging, and I hope to go into that a little bit later, is that this can be changed, okay? You can move people 20 percentage points on this when you give them the facts, when you give them and demonstrate that scientific consensus to them, because it's just not something they know about, because the disinformation campaign has been so successful. Okay, go 2 slides forward, please. So is climate change harmful? Again, we're seeing, it's very interesting to look at this downscaling at the county level, because you can just very quickly visually, your eyes are so efficient at picking out these discrepancies or these differences. So 71% of Alameda County, California is worried about climate change. Only 38% of Beaver County in Utah is. And if you're trying to promote certain policies or get certain regulations passed, tackling climate change in some way, mitigating it, then you're going to want to know that, what's happening at the local level and who's supporting you. And we can now do that. So, okay, moving on. Next slide. This is, what about our last message? Is there hope? This is a slide from the People's Climate March in the September 2014 in New York City. And so, as probably you're all aware, there were many small groups who have been working on the issue. They really reached a critical mass, and they organized, as you know, a giant march in New York that I believe gathered upwards of 400,000 people. And so we actually went with our group of students here that work with us to, we went to the march and we conducted some informal interviews to ask people who were attending and marching what made them hopeful about climate change. And basically the responses broke into 3 groups. One group said they're not hopeful. They said they're just out here because it's their moral obligation, their duty, and they want to try to do something. The second group said essentially they weren't hopeful until the day of the march, and the march in and of itself made them feel much more hopeful that changes could occur and that climate change could be tackled successfully. The third group was super hopeful. They gave a lot of examples. Look at what California is doing. Look at what Obama is trying to roll out. Look at the Clean Power Plan, the billions of dollars being invested in clean energy subsidies every year. They were really feeling very tangibly like the movement was building and that enormous issues have been tackled before: civil rights, the ozone hole, gay marriage, legalizing it in every state, and so forth. And if this is just one of the, we can get together and make change here. And so we asked this, next slide please, we also asked this on a nationally representative survey as well, and so we can show, some of our downscaling work can show this, that the extent of hope, that people do support regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant pretty broadly, and especially as you can see in the 2 coasts, and that's hopeful. So that's the end of the of what I wanted to present on our downscaling work. If you could just move on to the next slide. What I'd like to do now is give an overview of the 6 Americas. We basically borrowed from the field of marketing, which commonly does segmentations of potential consumers of their products, right? Well, so we wanted to do a segmentation of the audience, the national audience for climate change. So as you saw, all the prior numbers that I presented to you were about Americans as a whole. But we all know that we don't speak in a single voice, and so these results on the 6 Americas are from one of our very useful studies, which is of course ongoing, that identifies 6 unique groups of Americans. It basically just clusters Americans into 6 different groups based on their attitudes, beliefs, and opinions about climate change. So the groups fall along this spectrum that you see here, but they don't perfectly map onto the Democrat-Republican divide, although that's part of the story. So just to go through each of these groups in turn. Now I should point out, you know, these, again, this data is almost a year old, so these percentages, the percentages of Americans in each of these groups, from the alarmed to the dismissive, change, but the relative sizes have stayed sort of the same. There's always more concerned and cautious than there are alarmed and dismissive. The trend is that the dismissive are actually shrinking and the alarmed are growing a little bit. But let's just move on a little bit to describe each of these segments. If you could move on to the next slide, please. So we see that the alarmed, they are very worried about global warming. They support climate policies. They're very likely to already have been engaged in climate activism for years, writing to their senators and so forth about it and trying to influence the policy process. And they have also already implemented changes in their own lives about it. But one thing that's important to note with them, first of all, I should say 12%. It sounds like a relatively small number, but think about that in terms of the numbers of Americans. That's about 40 million people. And the primary challenge for this group is to get them organized. In political science terms, that's called an issue public. And a lot of our work now in terms of sort of the implementation and lessons learned from our findings is to try to get this community organized. It's sort of the climate movement 2 or even 3.0. We obviously had some failures with previous bills in Congress, but we're trying to help get this community better organized using the findings from our data. So that's an issue public that's very important to key into and to organize. Let's move on to the next slide, please. The concerned is about, almost 1 out of 3 people in the country are concerned about climate change, but they don't see it as something that's happening so much here and now in their own lives, and they see that it's mostly down the road, future generations, other countries, and they're generally supportive of making policies to tackle policies that would tackle climate change, but they're unlikely to have been involved and tried to influence the process themselves. Next slide, please. So with the cautious, they are what we call fence sitters. They're also a pretty large portion of the population. They see it as an even more distant problem that's really just completely irrelevant to their everyday lives, and they don't really have any strong opinions about it. All right, moving on to the next slide. The disengaged are really just, they might not even ever have heard of the term, and they just don't think about it ever. It's just not at all a concern to them. It's far too abstract. Moving on to the next slide. The doubtful tend to be educated about it, but they really challenge that it is especially anthropogenic. They may believe that it's happening, but they really don't think it's human caused. They tend to be more conservative also and religious. And finally, moving on to the next slide, the dismissive. They don't think it's happening at all. They're very opposed to policies, and they actively work to undermine the climate movement and progress on policy making to tackle climate change, either from an adaptation or mitigation perspective. And just the opposite of the alarmed, they have spent a lot of time trying to influence the policy process against taking action on the issue. And they're also part of the disinformation campaign, and they will do a lot of blogging and spend a lot of time sowing doubt. All right, so next slide, please. So what we have here are, these are the photographic representations of the 6 Americas, and we don't ask this all the time, but we have asked open-ended questions in our surveys. If you could ask an expert on global warming one question, which question would you ask? And so what we find is that there are at least 3 different conversations going on. So, the doubtful and the dismissive. How do I know that it's happening, and why should I trust you? They're very skeptical and just not trusting and, constantly challenging. In the middle, with the cautious and the disengaged, they're genuinely curious. They're like, well, why is this something that we should be concerned about? And especially, in my daily life, why should I care? And then with the alarmed and the cautious, they're like, okay, we're motivated. We want to take action. We're worried about this, but tell us what we can do. We don't know what to do. So there's a little bit of frustration and anxiety there that can be channeled, as I mentioned, into organizing and creating an issue public to take action. So next slide, please. So here, this is a little bit dated, but it continues to be important and relevant. In 2010, we conducted a study of Americans' knowledge of climate change. Now, that's a little different from what we usually do, because what we usually do is more opinion, attitude, policy preferences, so forth. This is actually on their knowledge. It was basically like a test of their knowledge of climate change and the Earth system. And what we found is that, and this chart basically shows how the 6 Americas fall out in terms of a straight scale, and you can see that, really, most people are not very well informed. So these misconceptions about the Earth system and climate change, of course, lead some people to doubt that it's happening or that it's anthropogenic, and to misunderstand both the causes and the solutions, and therefore they're unaware of the risks, and that puts them in a more vulnerable position vis-a-vis the impacts, of course. So just to summarize here, we see that there are 6 distinct Americas that respond to the issue of climate change in very different ways. The facts of climate change are actively interpreted by these different audiences who construct their own mental models in accordance with what they know, value, and feel. One thing to be aware of course, is that knowledge is necessary, but it's also insufficient to get to action in most cases. Some audiences know the basic facts, or they need to know the basic facts because they don't know anything about it. Others accept that it might be happening, but they don't know why they should care. Other groups accept that it's happening and that it's human-caused, but they don't know what can be done to solve it. And finally, some are convinced that it's a conspiracy, and the more scientific information you give them, the bigger the conspiracy appears. Those are the dismissive. So on to the next slide. So how do Americans communicate about climate change? Next slide, please. A couple of years ago, we conducted a survey specifically asking this question and asking respondents, who could best persuade you to take action on the issue of global warming. So those findings were very interesting, specifically on how people express and convey information on the topic and how they best receive it. And our #1 finding there was, and this comes as no surprise to anybody, I'm sure, that loved ones and one's own children and other children actually are best at convincing respondents to take action on the issue. Can you move on to the next slide, please? So talking is better than tweeting. With these huge uptick in social media and us included, spending a great deal of time and effort to frame messages that are appropriate for 140 characters on Twitter, for example, or very visual messages on Facebook or LinkedIn. What we found in our survey across the board was that people are not going to be incentivized to change their behavior through social media. It's really more by conversations between familiars that will really get them to make a change. Next slide, please. Another thing about communication is visualization. That is just so important. And this slide just shows this balloon, this black balloon, that shows exactly what a ton of carbon dioxide looks like. We often use the phrase, well, every American emits 22 tons or so of carbon dioxide every year. But that's like speaking Latin to your dog or something. I mean, who can visualize what 22 tons of carbon dioxide looks like? Well, here's what 1 ton looks like. And it's just a very powerful kind of visual that people love. It gets them to stop, start chatting, start having conversation about it, which is another thing that we found is important, as I just showed you. So visualization, and it can be just so highly charged in just such an efficient way to convey information, knowledge, and to help change people's opinions. Next slide, please. And just to wrap up, here's some ideas. We can wrap up by talking about some ideas for framing messages. If you can go on to the next slide. This is just a summary of some points that Stefan Lewandowski, who's with the University of Bristol, came up with a few years ago. Just some ideas for how to convey the urgency of taking action on climate change, and to convince people that, even if they're still skeptical, risk management. You take out insurance on your house, you don't think it's going to burn down, but you still take out insurance because it's possible. So shouldn't we do what we can to adapt to climate change and mitigate it, even if you don't necessarily believe that it's happening? or with clean energy, as I already mentioned. That's huge for Americans. We're very interested in entrepreneurship and making money in the capitalist business model. That works really well for these innovative new technologies that can really help reduce our dependence on fossil fuels as a source of energy. It turns out also that human health is actually huge, and we have tons of data on it. I just didn't dwell on it in this presentation, but that's an excellent frame for talking about climate change. People are always concerned about their health. It gets them to focus on themselves as an individual and how healthy they are. So it really brings it home to that, sort of ego individual level. If you can talk about, the larger threats from insect vectors moving north as the earth warms, increases in asthma rates as the air gets warmer, so on and so forth. That's very, very important, and we have a lot of studies that make that connection and show how it's influential in terms of changing people's minds on climate. The last is more the security frame for messaging. The Pentagon is working a lot, is addressing climate change and looking at where we're vulnerable and where the world is vulnerable and where the next humanitarian crisis is going to be. And as we already see that happening with a massive refugee crisis, it is at least partially attributable to, obviously there are huge political problems, but there's one of the origins of the political crisis was the fact that the earth was getting drier in parts of the Middle East, and populations that had formerly been able to depend on farming exclusively for their livelihoods no longer could because of increasing aridity. And so they were moving into cities and creating demand pressures in cities for jobs and so forth that just could not be met. So those are some frames that are useful. Next slide, please. So here's this slide, just shows some common gaps and misunderstandings about climate. I think a big one for perhaps the wetlands community is to focus on this misconstruction that's very common in the American public, and I think probably worldwide, that humans have only small impacts on the planet, and to just drive home that point that we've now altered more than 50% of the planet's land surface. Another one is, people often confuse weather and climate. The old adage, climate is what you expect and weather is what you get. It's important to understand the distinction on that. And surprisingly, we found a surprisingly large number of people in our survey that we did on 2010 and knowledge that people were still confusing the ozone hole with global warming, and obviously they're completely unrelated. It's important. Some other ideas here that I think are very important for the wetlands community, actually, this is the top one, that adaptation, it's probably something that you're talking about a lot in your own line of work, how to adapt to increased flooding and increased extreme weather events on coasts and so forth. That's something I think a lot about as a Connecticut resident. So there's a lot of discussions about adaptation for coastal communities. And people are interested in that because it reduces risks. Now, so that's interesting because I would say 5 years ago and certainly 10 years ago, there was sort of an exclusive focus on the part of the climate community to talk about mitigation. Like, no, we don't want to talk about adaptation because we want to mitigate, we don't want to adapt. Well, now we're at the point, obviously, where we need to adapt. And that actually has been shown in our work to lead to more openness to discussions of mitigation and to thinking about mitigation as the ultimate kind of solution to climate change. So beginning a conversation about global warming by talking about adaptation measures can actually open people up and make them more sensitive and interested in talking about actually reducing carbon emissions and so forth. So another tip is to communicate causation, why it's happening. Use metaphors. We often use the sports metaphor. Barry Bonds was a huge slugger. I believe he was with the Atlanta Braves at least for a while. Sorry, I'm not a sports person. But he took steroids to enhance his slugging ability. So every time he made a home run, you could not attribute that home run to the fact that he took steroids, but you could attribute the increase in the number of home runs he made to the fact that he took steroids. And it's the same with the weather. So this is this thing about attributing extreme weather to climate. is that on average we're having more extreme weather events, and so it's sort of like global warming is just supercharging the weather, the same way that steroids were supercharging Barry Bonds' arms. And for the facts of climate change, for example, this very simple fact that 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is real and that it's anthropogenic, it seems that very straightforward and simple visuals work the very best. And that's why I kept, I think twice or three times in this presentation, I've shown that pie chart of the scientific consensus. Because we conducted a message experiment in which we used that pie chart to see whether people would, change their minds or show higher rates of belief in climate change once they were shown that chart. And it proved to work very, very effectively, more than more complicated analogies that were made or simply textual descriptions that they had to read. So those really, really simple visuals are really good. In terms of, and again, I just want to repeat that thing about the scientific consensus. It's a gateway belief that leads to greater belief and willingness to act on the part of individuals. So that's like probably the #1 thing to try to get across. And then mobilizing and identifying your issue public, whether it's the folks who are alarmed at the local level and are going to be on your side in terms of getting some kind of regulation passed that you're working on. It's important to be able to identify them, get them together, and involve them. And our downscaling work can help with that. Next slide, please. And I think that's where I'd like to leave it. I hope we have just a few minutes for questions. I see that it's already 1:50. I'm going to give this back to Jillian. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa, for that engaging and thought-provoking presentation. So we can open the question and answer period. So if you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the questions box, and then I can read it back. I'm just going to try to access the question box here. Looks like we have several questions. The first one, do you have any sense of public trust in farmers? I've thought if more non-believers heard farmers speaking on their farming struggles, it would be effective.
Thank you. That's a very excellent question, and I didn't focus on it in this presentation, but well, I did mention trusted messengers, and I mentioned that scientists are among the most trusted messengers. If you can find a trusted messenger who is a farmer, who speaks well, who gives good sound bites, who can, for example, engage in conversation maybe with a local meteorologist who's popular, that can definitely be an excellent, excellent tool. So again, look for your trusted messengers. See if, is there a farming spokesperson in a particular community who people turn to? Well, that person is going to be a great connector to gain some traction on the issue, for sure.
Here's another question. Have you thought about whether continuing to ask people if they believe in climate change is actually inadvertently validating that it's uncertain?
Good question. I don't think so. I mean, think about it this way. As I mentioned, there's only a few over. It's basically the number of people in our surveys to get this nationally representative data hovers around 1,000. So it's not as if we're broadcasting this, really broadly, and that a lot of people are seeing this particular question. It's really, it's called a knowledge panel survey that our field house puts together for us, and it's essentially a very small number of individuals. And I would say it's really based on what I've seen of the incoming data that we get whenever we conduct these surveys, that it's not changing public opinion. One thing to note is that we, not on all our surveys, but because it's very expensive, but we occasionally ask open-ended questions which then need to be coded. And those are always fascinating to look at. And so one of the open-ended questions is, what is the first word or phrase that comes to mind when I say the term global warming, or sometimes we say the term climate change. And it's just astounding to me, because I'm in this little ivory tower bubble here in a very liberal state, in a town that's even more liberal than the state, to find the percentage of people, it's very, very high, who come back and say, just a bunch of hogwash, it's Al Gore, it's just politics, don't believe this for a minute. It's quite amazing. So I don't really think that question is making people feel like they shouldn't, that it's something that they shouldn't believe in.
I think we have time for one more quick question before I have a couple final announcements.
Okay.
What does it matter which term you use, global warming or climate change?
Right. So that's actually very interesting, and we have done some work on that. We actually have a report on our website that's called, if you can look it up, called What's in a Name? Global Warming versus Climate Change. Fascinating results. Really good question. Thank you. It turns out that just the bottom line on that is that climate change is a more neutral term. It has broader appeal. It also, as you know, captures the range of impacts better. But depending on what community you're trying to mobilize, for example, with the alarmed, we've been able to show that the term global warming motivates them better. They're already deeply concerned about it. Global warming sounds a little bit more threatening. With that particular audience, that's good, because it's going to motivate them to take action about it. But if you're trying to convince people of the reality of global warming and the need to take action, climate change is a little bit more neutral and broader.
Okay, I just have to ask one more question that just
Sure.
popped. How do you respond to the alarm group about what they can do about it, and how can wetlands be a part of the solution?
Well, I do not know, because I'm not a wetlands person. How can the alarmed? I think that I always kind of try to visualize, you folks going out there and doing your work, and especially on the adaptation side, in terms of convincing communities to take action, to retain wetlands, to build more wetlands, to make them more robust to extreme weather events and so forth. The alarmed always want to know what they can do, and there are many things. One is to get themselves organized. In the anti-nuclear 1970s, which I know is really dating myself for many of you who are listening, I'm sure, there were a lot of sort of living room seminars where friends would just get together, friends and neighbors would get together and talk about what they could do. They would do letter writing campaigns together, join the movement. There's also a really great national organization called Citizens Climate Lobby, CCL. They do, I believe, monthly phone calls with updates on what are the policy actions being taken in different areas and also federally. They'll teach you how to lobby. You can come to Washington and learn how to lobby your elected representatives. So there are definitely things to do. We also have like a 2-page primer on that on our website called What Can I Do? And it's just a tab you can click and just go right in there and check it out. I mean, none of it is rocket science at all. A lot of it is just write letters, call your congressman, get organized at the local level, demand, put solar panels on your house or investigate if you can do it, that kind of thing. So there's individual and political actions that are both kind of spelled out there.
Thank you, Lisa. We really appreciate that. And I will see if there's a way that additional questions can get answered. We're running out of time. I just would like everyone to know to mark their calendars for the next webinar on February 11th. We will have a very interesting talk. Does the Paris Climate Agreement create new opportunities for wetland policy on the world stage? With Dr. Bill Mumma from Tufts University. He's also served on the IPCC many times and authored many of their reports. And then northern peatlands and the global carbon balance, why we all need to care, with Dr. Nigel Roulet from McGill University, a global leader on northern peatlands and their impact on the rest of the globe's carbon cycle and climate change. So we hope that you'll all be able to join us for that, and I think our webinar time is about to end. And thanks again, Lisa, and thanks to the audience for attending.
Thank you very much.